morning. All that travel got me saying, I think it's because it's so dark. I'm incredibly honored to be here with you all. This is a special MLK program.
Yeah.
This is special. It's, I feel a bit, I have to be honest with you, I feel like I've been set up just a bit. The three young folk that read their speeches and gave their essays far better than I'm gonna be, so we manage your expectations right away. But to hear their stories and to hear their journeys and their struggles and the ways that they're going to navigate this world and give us new ideas and new hope, birthing ideas and birthing new spaces of possibility, even birthing babies. All of it is extraordinary, and I'm so grateful. That wonderful choir did all three verses of Lift Every Voice. That's how you know when people are for real. I saw some of y'all mumbling when it got to Stony Road. We gonna work it out. Black History Month, I want everybody to get all three verses down. But what a moment. We have the opportunity to honor the life and the legacy, the journey, the struggle, and sacrifice of the great Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most extraordinary figures this country has ever produced. And so when we honor him, when we discuss him, when we frame him, I think the best thing we can do to honor the legacy of King is to honor him as he was. So easy to reduce King. So easy to shrink King. King has become like a green screen. Everybody, Democrat, Republican, left wing, right wing, conservative, radical, liberal, centrist, right, wrong, don't matter. They all project onto Dr. King what they are and what they think, and they convince us that that's what he was. But Dr. King was very clear. His legacy is very clear. His project was very clear. His mission was very clear. And so, for me, to honor King's legacy, we have to be honest about who he was. And we have to be committed to taking up that project. There's never been a moment where we ain't need King since he arrived on this planet. But my God, we need him so much right now. We're prosecuting wars around the globe. Here at home, we have so much violence, injustice, inequality. We're expanding our prisons and shrinking our schools. The richest empire in human history. We have children who go to bed hungry every single night. We have violence in our cities, violence from the state itself, poison in our water. Hatred. white supremacy still prevails in many places. Not just around the world, but in our minds. Anti-Semitism on the rise. Pervasive, always, but on the rise in the United States and around the globe. We live in a culture where sexual violence, rape culture prevails in too many sectors of our culture and our society. And many of the places and institutions that were designed to protect us have been eliminated or privatized, marketized, profitized. I'll make up a word, I don't care. We are in a moment of chaos. Dr. King writes an essay and a book where he raises the question that I want to talk about this morning. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? There's no doubt we're in a moment of chaos. The question is, do we turn on each other or do we turn to each other? How do we form that community? What King would call the beloved community. How do we get there? 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 I'm going to offer a few things that I think King would encourage us to do to get there. The first thing we have to do is release our imagination. We must release our imagination. Spill my water. What does it mean to release our imagination? See, King comes out of a theological tradition. King was not an evangelical like some want him to be. King was not a fundamentalist like some would argue he was, but King was deeply rooted in the Christian tradition. King was a baby preacher. And after he finished Morehouse at 16, he went over to Crozier Theological Seminary before going off to Boston to study and get his PhD. King saw a direct connection between his politics and his faith. It was that faith that allowed him to release his imagination. Now, there's some secular folk in the room. There's some atheists and agnostics in the room. I ain't mad at you. I'm saying that whether you are religious or not, we must be willing to release our imaginations to imagine worlds that are not yet. But for King, that was rooted strictly in a tradition that said that I might step out on nothing and land on something. That said that I don't know what the end is going to be, but I know we're going to be all right because I believe in something bigger than me. So for King, he couldn't be prisoner of the moment because he came out of a tradition that had a cross. And as he learned from Howard Thurman and other theologians that said that the story of the cross is not a story of death, but it's a story of the endless possibilities of God, that nothing, even death, can have the final word of what's possible for life. But that ain't just a religious narrative. For King, he transported the sacred and moved it into the secular so that he understood that as people struggling for justice and freedom, nothing can have the final word on what we do, that we can always imagine new futures. Slave masters didn't retire. Slave masters didn't get tired of holding plantations. Slaves got tired of being enslaved, and we resisted. Abolitionists resisted. The people resisted. Nothing can tell the final story of our destiny but us. That's what I want y'all to do today, because there ain't no point in me talking to y'all if y'all imaginations are constrained by the moment? What's the point of talking about justice if our biggest vision of justice is warmer and fuzzier prisons? King would ask us to imagine a world of justice, where justice doesn't mean punishment, punishment don't mean confinement. We can dream outside of the prison. We can dream more ambitious freedom dreams. We can dream better than that. As Thurman said, never scale down your dreams to the level of that which is your immediate experience. It means you don't have to be prisoner of the event, prisoner of the statistic, prisoner of our condition. I don't want to live in a world where justice is the Me Too movement. I want to live in a world where we get rid of misogyny and patriarchy and sexism so that we're not punishing men for mistreating women and mistreating their bodies, but we live in a world where we get that out of our consciousness so that we can see women as full human beings and women can navigate the world safely and with dignity and with protection. I want a bigger freedom dream. That's what King wanted. He was getting us to get outside the moment. Because the moment said we separate is equal. That's what they told us in 1896. He said we can dream bigger than that. Thurgood Marshall said we can dream bigger than that. Thank you, baby. We, in 2020, have to imagine bigger freedom dreams than sprinkling some money to the poor. We need to reimagine this economic system so that the poor don't work all day and not make enough money. People working 15, 18 hours a day, 20 days a week, and the month still lasts longer than your money. We gotta imagine something else. So release your imaginations with me, family. Can we do that? The next thing we have to do in the tradition of King is to listen carefully. King was a listener. He's known as a speaker, but King was a listener. He took seriously intellectual traditions. King read deeply and widely. They would joke that at Revival, everybody want to preach with King. Preachers are competitive people, even if they don't admit it. And day one, they could all preach with King. They brought their best stuff. Day two, some was still hanging with him. They said day three, his PhD kicked in. They meant that his understanding of history was deeper and wider. That he listened to history. When King is giving his mountaintop speech, and he's giving us that surveil of history on April 3rd, 1968, when he talks about what it would mean for him to go across human history and begin in Athens and sit as Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides, and Aristophanes assembled around the Parthenon. He wasn't just playing linguistic games. He was trying to situate us within a moment of human history, and then he connected it to his namesake Martin Luther, the Church of Wittenberg, and he connected it to JFK, not to JFK, but to Lincoln, and he connected from Lincoln to Roosevelt, and he was trying to get us to understand human history, because King understood that you can't change history if you don't know history. Listen to history. Students, you got to listen to history. King was deeply rooted in Gandhian philosophy. And Sister Huda said he also read Thoreau. He also read folk he ain't agree with. We live in a moment that's so isolated, so tribalistic, that we only engage and listen to folk who agree with us already. I watch this channel, you watch that channel. And it turns out if I watch 5 hours of programming on my channel, I was right all along. You watch your channel, you was right all along. We must engage deeply and challenge one another and challenge ourselves. Students, if you go through this university for 4 years and get a 4.0, but no part of your thinking has changed, no part of your understanding of the world has been disrupted, if no part of your intellectual framework has been unsettled, then you have failed. King, listen. On January the 15th, 1968, King wakes up, has breakfast with his family, gets dressed, puts on his jeans, throws on a windbreaker jacket, heads over to Dexter Avenue. They had a small cake for him, they sang happy birthday. But then he began to listen. He listened to Negro preachers. It was a long meeting. I'm gonna take my seat in a minute. That's how you know they winding up. But they were talking about how to build on the gains of 64 and 65. He listened to them. He met with Chicano activists. He was fascinated by other movements and how they could intersect, but he was also fascinated by the work that was happening at the border and on the West Coast. He listened to them. He met with sanitation workers from Chicago. One had been mauled. He was trying to figure out how to get safer working conditions, how to get living wages, and how to get workers' rights. He listened to them. He met with anti-war activists, trying to figure out how they could stop that thing in Vietnam. He listened to them. He listened to them because it was the moral thing to do, it was the ethical thing to do. He had a deep investment in their politics, to be sure. But King also understood it strategically. See, King wasn't just a Negro preacher as much as they like you to think that. King was one of the great political strategists of the 20th century. And he understood that we were better if we weren't merely locked at the arms singing "We Shall Overcome," but also locked at the circumstance. He understood that America had a different response if we had a united front, if we had a broader array of folk fighting for freedom. He understood, quite frankly, that if white folk were in the movement, that America will respond differently. He saw what happened when JFK walks through Harlem in 1960, holding up a black baby. It was dismissed as a campaign stunt. He's trying to make Adam Clayton Powell happy. Trying to get some cheap votes in Harlem. You know how those Northerners are. Kind of like Bill Clinton going on an Arsenio Hall show playing the saxophone. or Hillary and Selma trying to clap on beat. In church. But it was dismissed as a campaign stunt. This stood in sharp contrast to when Bobby Kennedy's in Appalachia holding up that white baby whose belly is bloated. Snot's coming out his nose, he's crying, he's hungry, and we mount our war on poverty. He understood that we had to whiten the face of poverty to make it real. Now, King's moral universe was different. His moral vision was different. King wanted to live in a world where a baby in Boston, or a baby in Berlin, or a baby in Botswana, or a baby in Birmingham are all worth the same, and they all get our investment and our love and our care. That's King's vision. But King was practical and pragmatic as well. King understood what needed to be done. Why am I telling you that? Because to live out King's legacy today, we must also be locked at the intersections of our movement. Don't tell me you're doing education reform and you ain't got time to think about prisons. Because the people who are getting low quality education, the people who don't get early childhood education, the people who don't get early literacy are often charted on a course to mass incarceration. Don't tell me you can't think about the military because you're thinking about poverty. Because it is the vast and mass hoarding of wealth that often leads vulnerable people to join in activities, both domestically and abroad, against other poor people through wars of force, through violence, through military. It is the privatization of the military, as King was warning us against 50 years ago, that makes money and profit motives involved in foreign policy. What does that mean? It means that oftentimes we're engaged in foreign policy intervention because it makes money. Gil Scott Heron said, everybody loves peace. The problem is you can't make no money off of it. So if the money is in war, then the vulnerable are the first to go to war, to fight other vulnerable people. Don't tell me, black people tell me this all the time, I hear you about environmental justice and everything, but I'm trying to get these police off my behind. I can't worry about the environment unless I'm worried until we work out this racism thing. Now one, that ain't what King was doing. King is fighting for the rights of workers in Memphis and their working conditions. That was as much a question of racial justice as it was environmental justice. You don't get a clean air bill or a clean water bill unless you have a civil rights bill. So understand there's a relationship here. But you ain't got to go to 64 to 65 to 66. You can go to Flint. If you think there's not a relationship between racism and the environment, look at where power plants are built. Look where waste is dumped. Look at where there's land in the water. Look at where things don't get cleaned up. Family, we got work to do, and we ain't got the luxury of being in our little silos. We got to connect with each other. We got to build with each other. We got to work with each other because that's what King wanted us to do. And King listened to folk because it made political sense. But King did something else. King follows in the tradition of African freedom fighters that taught America to listen to itself. We don't get how deep King was. King knew how to package it. But King was calling on America to do something else. It's one thing to say, be different. It's another thing to say, be what you said you're gonna be. Then we get in a relationship, people change. They talk real heavy when y'all dating. You get some years in, stuff they used to do, they don't do. Sometimes you got to remind people, remember what you said. Remember who you was. Remember what you promised. That's what King is doing when he stands in front of Lincoln on August 28, 1963. In front of Lincoln, he is making a cry to America to do what it said it was going to do. King stands in front of Lincoln. Remember, it's a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. They like to cut that last part out. It wasn't just Negroes marching. We don't just march to march. We was marching for jobs and freedom. Why is that significant? See, he comes out of a signifying tradition. All the way back to West Africa, the Eshu Elegba. Signifying monkeys. He understood that sometimes you ain't got to say it, you just got to show it. So we have an Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. So what does King do? 100 years later, 1963. He stands in front of Lincoln. a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand, signed an Emancipation Proclamation. Oh, he said, wait a minute, you emancipated us, but we having a march here 100 years later for freedom. So what has happened? He's raising a question, but you gotta understand, he ain't the first to do that. Students, go back and read David Walker's appeal. Because that's whose shoulders he's standing on, because King read deeply. David Walker's appeal, a preamble together with 4 articles to the colored citizens of the world, but particularly and most expressly, those of the United States. That's the title. He made a book with a preamble and 4 articles, marking it after what? The Constitution. So when David Walker is making an abolitionist document, and he got killed right before that Turner's Rebellion for that document, he is calling for America to do what it said it was going to do in that Constitution. When Lamont Equiano, otherwise known as Gustavus Vassa, writes narrative of the life of Lamont Equiano, Gustavus Vassa, written by himself, and he writes in the book about the good Christian traders. He says, America, you say you got some Christian values, but I, as a Negro, am unfree. This woman is unfree. This poor person is unfree. Your Christianity ain't catching up with your humanity. Listen to yourself. He said, I come here to the nation's capital to cash a check. See, we want to reduce King to the little black boys and little black girls and little white boys, little white girls at the table of brotherhood. That's important. King wanted to live in a world where race was not a demerit. King wanted to live in a world where your whiteness or my blackness or her brownness didn't stop us from accessing social goods. He wanted people to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But that was the gravy on the speech. The meat of the speech was about broken promises. He said, I came to the nation's capital to cash a check. He referred to the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation and the Constitution as promissory notes. He said they like money. And he said, some of y'all can relate to this, he said the Negro's check has been returned in sufficient funds. He said the Negro sits on an island of poverty amidst a vast ocean of material wealth and prosperity. King wasn't just calling for the world to look black, white, red, and yellow like a Pharrell video or a Gap commercial. He was calling for America to do what it said it was going to do. King was calling on a tradition. King was saying, America, on paper, you offer life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody. You promised 1896. You promised Plessy versus Ferguson. 1863, emancipation. You promised America. 1954, Brown v. Board of Education. America, you promised. 1955, Brown v. Board 2. America, you promised. 1964, public accommodations. America, you promised. 1965, voting rights act. America, you promised. The call of King is for America to be a nation as good as its promise. We gotta follow that legacy right now. We gotta get this nation to be as good as its promise. We're not a nation as good as our promise if everybody doesn't have access to high quality education. We're not a nation as good as its promise if we ban Muslims from entering the country. We're not a nation as good as our promise if all the things that were public get moved to the private. We're not as good as our promise if people are marching against black folk and Jewish brothers and sisters in Charlottesville. And the highest offices in the land can't even denounce it. We're not a nation that builds our promise. So let's listen, but let us work. I'm gonna take my seat in a minute. We gotta do one more thing, family. We need courageous action. We need courageous action. You don't remember nothing else I told y'all tonight? Today. By the time I finish, it's gonna be night. You don't remember nothing else I tell y'all. Remember this. Biggest problem in the world today is that there's too many people who don't do nothing. We dying in the streets. We gotta do something. Our babies are getting killed. We gotta do something. We got elections coming up. Whoever you voting for, organize, register, and vote. We got to do something. See, King comes out of a tradition of analysis and action. Some folk got a whole bunch of action and ain't thought about nothing. But some of us in the university get so much pleasure from talking about how poor their analysis is and how they don't have context. They're not situated within the literature. And all y'all situated in the literature and they don't go nowhere. Got a tank full of gas and don't move the car. What good is it to have analysis if you ain't got action? King didn't just read Gandhi. He lived it. King was about mass action. When dogs bite us in Birmingham, we bleed everywhere. King was about courageous action. Folks say King wasn't courageous because he was talking nonviolence. Ain't nothing more courageous than nonviolence. Now, for him it was a philosophy. For me it's more of a tactic. He and I ain't on the exact same page on that. God ain't finished with me yet, I guess. But the amount of discipline it takes to engage in nonviolent resistance, first at the spiritual level. King said the first articulation of my human dignity is that I will not allow another person's actions toward me to shape my actions toward them. That is a deep fundamental commitment. King said, nonviolence might not stop you from hating me, but it'll stop me from hating you. That's a big moral and spiritual commitment. King understood the discipline. King, September 20th, 1958, was stabbed at a book signing with a letter opener by a black person. Sometimes your skin folk ain't your kinfolk. But he continued to argue and advocate for nonviolence both in his personal life, but also politically. You couldn't just go on a freedom ride. This isn't just King, that's what I'm trying to say, there's a bigger context. When you went on freedom rides, you had to train and be disciplined so that when you got spit on, when you got bit, when you got sprayed with hoses, you would have the discipline to stand still and not fight back. That's a very particular type of courage. That's a very particular type of discipline. That's why when I hear some of these young folks say, I ain't my ancestors, they would get these heads. No! That is inaccurate, it is ahistorical, it is disrespectful to a tradition that had the most radical displays of courage, the most radical displays of revolutionary love, the most radical displays of discipline. about courageous action. King was about courageous truth-telling. King spoke against the triplet of misery, the triplet of evil, racism, poverty, and militarism. And he lived it. But King didn't just tell the truth when it was easy. August 28, 1963, he's a hero. Time Magazine Man of the Year. King was killed on April 4th, 1968. But on April 4th, 1967, he walks in the Riverside Church in New York and gives a speech, Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam. He talked about his calling. He talked about his vocation. He referred to it as a vocation of agony sometimes. Sometimes when you gotta, as Reverend Barber said, sometimes when you got to proclaim this truth, it can be heavy on you. Speaking the truth can be a burden. Fighting for justice can be a burden. For Christians, reading the red letters is heavy. For Muslims, following the Sunnah is heavy. For social justice organizers, knowing what the world is supposed to be like can be a burden every single day on your spirit. King carried that burden. And he walked in the Riverside Church. He spoke out against the war in Vietnam because that was difficult. See, when he's telling Negroes not to fight back, white folk loved him. But when he said that same spirit of nonviolence compels me to say we can't fight in Vietnam. He said, how can I tell people in the slums of Harlem or Watts not to use guns and knives when they say, what about Vietnam? He said, how can I be nonviolent in America and support violence abroad? And he said, I can no longer remain silent. The legislation that was passed happens because King has a relationship with the White House. He has a relationship with Johnson. But after that announcement that he opposed the war in Vietnam, the door to the White House was closed to him. He was no longer loved. He was no longer seen as a wise man. Now they said stay in the Negro preacher's place. And the Negro preachers didn't want him either. They kicked him out of the Baptist convention. Said he was too vain. That he was always in the newspapers, all in the videos. See, we like to misremember King. Every white person loved him, every black person marched. It was hard to imagine how he got killed. But he was an enemy of the state when he died. He was not loved. 63's Man of the Year. 68, he couldn't make Time Magazine's, People Magazine's Most Admired Americans list. He couldn't get a speech. American Program Bureau's agency couldn't book him. The Baptist Convention didn't want him. The White House wouldn't talk to him. Morehouse College, his alma mater, wouldn't put him on the board of trustees. They said he was a bad influence on young people. Said he went to jail too much. See, this is the king that they don't want you to know. Now they want to put him on a placemat and on a sign or a window or going at a business sale. But the king that I'm talking about was a radical, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, revolutionary Christian I move to my conclusion. My dear family, we got to follow that tradition. What does that mean for you all? It means you're organized. Join an organization. I didn't say start one, I said join one. Because in this age of self-indulgence and selfies and everybody's going live and everybody got their own feed and everybody doing all this stuff for themselves, we can't lose sight of community. Join an organization. If you're in an organization, make your organization do what it's supposed to do. You part of the NAACP, don't be no neoliberal, wealth building. As Abernathy says, scratching when you don't itch and laughing when you're not tickled NAACP. You're gonna be radical Christians, be radical Christians. Don't be Creflo Christians. Don't be up here talking about God meant me to drive a Bentley. I'm talking about something deeper. I'm talking about love for the least of these. What you do to the least of these, you ain't done unto me. That's what I'm talking about. All these black Greeks, so Greek metal organizations in the room. King was one of them too, he was an alpha. Nobody's perfect. But you got to be willing to make that organization do what it's supposed to do. That means we can't be out here just strutting and party walking and dancing and barking. We got to do more than that. We got to have the highest ideal of brotherhood and scholarship and commitment. Don't just talk about what you did to get in. Talk about what you did once you got in. That's the tradition of King. That's the tradition of us. And be courageous. The Prophet Muhammad said, speak the truth though it may be bitter. We have to be willing to speak the truth when it's difficult. King didn't just speak the truth when it was popular. He spoke the truth when it made him an enemy of the state. Du Bois spoke the truth though it made him an enemy of the state. Garvey spoke the truth though it made him an enemy of the state. Angela Davis spoke the truth though it made her an enemy of the state. Harriet Tubman spoke the truth though it made her an enemy of the state. Fannie Lou Hamer spoke the truth though it made her an enemy of the state. Ella Baker spoke the truth though it made her an enemy of the state. We got to be willing to be courageous. We can't speak out against wars when they Bush's wars and Trump's wars and say nothing when Democrats send predator drones around the world to kill the vulnerable. The drones don't care if they got a Democrat or Republican seal on them. King wouldn't care either. We got to speak out and tell the truth. We can't oppose. We can't be about partisanship. We have to be about principles. We got to tell the truth though it may be bitter. But understand, if you take this route, you're going to be alone. When Malcolm died on February 21st, 1965, he'd been abandoned by so many. When King died, April 4th, 1968, he'd been abandoned by so many. We love Angela now, but in 1970, so many people supported her not even being allowed to work in the state of California. And when she faced the death penalty 3 times, 3 charges, so many people turned their backs to her. She was alone. And if you do this work, you're going to be alone. You're going to speak out on campus, you're going to be alone. Some of you students, you're going to organize parties and 1 million people are going to show up. You have an education or a teaching, 5 people are going to show up. You're going to be alone. Some of y'all work with good white, liberal white people. They love black people till it's time to hire one. For white folk, you got to stand up and be courageous. You got to be that John Brown. It's going to make you alone, but it's going to be worth it. Some of y'all gonna speak out against race and you're gonna get support, but you speak out for women's rights and the men gonna scatter and turn into Hotep Harry. You're gonna be alone, but you gotta keep fighting. Some folk will be willing to have a critique of one thing, but not the other. You got to be willing to be alone, because the best of our tradition means that you're alone. You don't need thousands of people with you. They'll be there once you win. They'll be there once you get near the finish line. They'll be there to say they was always with you. About 13 to 15% of black folk marched for civil rights in 1963. See, most of the folk weren't involved. They now say